All right, today we are on Judges starting chapter 14. We learned about the birth of Samson and the calling on his life as a Nazarite,
That's all right.
Right.
Nazarite. We discussed the difference between the Nazarite and the Nazarene yesterday. Now we're heading into chapter 14. I don't think mine has any breaks. It does not. Is yours?
Mine doesn't either.
Why don't we just go straight through because they do seem to be reading very easily and quickly. Kim, would you like to read this morning?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Judges 14. Samson asks a riddle. One day, when Samson was in Timnah, he noticed a certain Philistine girl. And when he got home, he told his father and mother that he wanted to marry her. They objected strenuously. Why don't you marry a Jewish girl? They asked. Why must you go and get a wife from these heathen Philistines? Isn't there one girl among all the people of Israel you could marry? But Samson told his father, she is the one I want. Get her for me. His father and mother didn't realize that the Lord was behind the request, for God was setting a trap for the Philistines, who at that time were the rulers of Israel. As Samson and his parents were going to Timnah, a young lion attacked Samson in the vineyards on the outskirts of the town. At that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and since he had no weapon, he ripped the lion's jaws apart and did it as easily as though it were a young goat. But he didn't tell his father or mother about it. Upon arriving at Timnah, he talked with the girl and found her to be just what he wanted, so the arrangements were made. When he returned for the wedding, he turned off the path to look at the carcass of the lion, and he found a swarm of bees in it and some honey. He took some of the honey with him, eating as he went, and gave some of it to his father and mother, but he didn't tell them where he had gotten it. As his father was making final arrangements for the marriage, Samson threw a party for 30 young men at the village, as was the custom of the day. When Samson asked if they would like to hear a riddle, they replied that they would. If you solve my riddle during these 7 days of the celebration, he said, I'll give you 30 plain robes and 30 fancy robes. But if you can't solve it, then you must give the robes to me. All right, they agreed. Let's hear it. This was his riddle. Food came out of the eater and sweetness from the strong. 3 days later, they were still trying to figure it out. On the fourth day, they said to his new wife, get the answer from your husband, or we'll burn down your father's house with you in it. Were we invited to this party just to make us poor? So Samson's wife broke down in tears before him and said, you don't love me at all. You hate me, for you have told a riddle to my people and haven't told me the answer. I haven't even told it to my father or mother. Why should I tell you? He replied. So she cried whenever she was with him and kept it up for the remainder of the celebration. At last, on the 7th day, he told her the answer, and she, of course, gave the answer to the young men. So before sunset on the 7th day, they gave him their reply. What is sweeter than honey? They asked, and what is stronger than a lion? If you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have found the answer to my riddle, he retorted. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he went to the city of Ashkelon, killed 30 men, took their clothing, and gave it to the young men who had told him the answer to his riddle. But he was furious about it and abandoned his wife and went back home to live with his father and mother. So his wife was married instead to the fellow who had been best man at Samson's wedding.
This woman he had to have. He had to have her.
You can't make this stuff up.
I thought that was pretty disgusting that he got honey out of the carcass of that lion.
But
I
as a
know.
Nazarite, he wasn't allowed to touch anything dead. So
Right.
I don't care whether it was dead or not. I just can't imagine scooping it out of a dead lion and eating it.
That's what I was thinking. Yuck.
Maybe that didn't apply to animals, just dead people.
maybe.
What I got
And
out
I
of
thought,
this too was this was all in the Lord's work, and I never really realized that before.
Yeah, you're right. It did say, and it was from the Lord, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him because he was
Yeah.
trying to accomplish something.
Well, and I don't even understand. The whole deal was based on these 30 plain robes and 30 fancy robes. But so Samson was going to give these robes to these young men, but if he can't solve it, then they have to give the robes to me. Well, where are the robes coming from? Because then later on, he kills 30 people and gives them those 30 robes. Like, I don't even get any of that. I don't understand.
Yeah, and then I question too the 30 silver coins that Judas got paid for Jesus. I wonder if there's some connection there.
Oh. And,
My
and that
Bible
comment about if you hadn't, uh,
plowed my
what is
way.
it? If
Heifer.
you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you
Yeah.
wouldn't have found the answer to the riddle. What's that mean?
His
It
wife.
means if you had not manipulated my wife, is what my
Oh,
Bible says. But we'll see what everybody else says.
I thought it meant messed with his
I
wife.
did too.
Maybe. Because she
you
ends
haven't
up
plowed
married
with
to his
my
best
heifer.
man. Maybe his best man was in on it, and he's like, "Here, you can have her."
Well, isn't that where she went afterwards then?
Yeah.
Yeah. She ended up being married to his best man. It was
Yeah.
given to his companion. Well, it says given,
Well, yeah.
like a piece of property, given to his companion who had been his best man.
My Bible says that these 30 men, apparently Samson's parents are rich.
That 30 comes up in all these judges' families.
Well, they were elite. They were the elite men of the town, young men of the town. All right. Maybe the commentaries will.
All right, Cindy, whenever you're ready.
Okay, 14, 1-4. She pleases me well. The Philistines were not among the 7 nations of Canaan, which Israel was specifically forbidden to marry.
Oh, that's interesting. The Philistines.
Oh,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, the Philistines.
Were not among
The 7.
the 7 nations of Canaan,
Okay.
which Israel was forbidden to marry.
That's interesting.
Nonetheless, Samson's choice was misdirected. Samson sins here, although God is sovereign and was able to turn the situation to please him. He was not at a loss, but used the opportunity to work against the wicked Philistines and provided gracious help to his people. He achieved destruction of these people not by an army, but by the miraculous power of one man. 14:7 talked. Such conversation was not acceptable in the East unless a couple was betrothed.
Now, wait a minute. What? What
You
verse?
couldn't talk unless you were engaged or betrothed to someone.
What verse are you on now?
Oh, 14:7 talked.
Hmm. 14. Oh, here we
He
go.
talked with the woman and was very pleased with her. Apparently, you weren't allowed to do that unless you were engaged.
Oh, 14:7. I was looking at verse 14. I'm like, I don't even see where they talked. 7. That he did not. He talked. Okay, so you couldn't do that unless you were engaged.
Right. 14:8 to get her. It was usually a year until a wedding. 14:9 he took some in his hands. Some scholars suggest that Samson violated his Nazirite standard by coming in contact with a dead body. Others reason that Numbers 6 specifies the body of a person, not an animal.
Oh, Kathy, I think it was you. You were right.
Whether or not he sinned here, the context does show instances of him sinning. 14:10, feast. The wedding feast usually lasted a week. 14:15, seventh. Some ancient authorities read fourth. The number may be fourth, 4 days starting after the 3 in verse 14, totaling 7 days as in verse 17. Or verse 15 may mean fourth, and verse 17 that the woman wept for the rest of the 7-day period of verse 12 after the 3 days of verse 14. What's it
There's-
matter?
Are they saying this is the wedding ceremony then?
The wedding feast during that time. See, that sounds so. When do they get married? At the end of that week?
When do they consummate it?
Yeah, because it said she married the best man then,
Yeah, I would assume they have to go through that week.
like rituals. You mean?
Do we remember
Well-
anything from those previous?
No. Um,
Because, like I said, he ends up marrying the best man. So they wouldn't have been married during this week period, right?
In verse 15, my Bible says, on the 4th day, they said to his new wife, get the answer from your husband.
let me see let me Google when a marriage is consummated in a Jewish wedding. Old Testament.
Yeah, it does, Kim.
Their marriage probably was never consummated because he got angry and left. So I don't think it was consummated. But my Bible says, go ask your wife, or,
Yeah.
you know,
Mhm.
Yeah, it could very well be. I mean, they had the ceremony, they got married, but that was the end of it. It never went any further than that. I mean, like you said, it wasn't consummated. That was just the ceremony, and that was it.
It does say here, so the betrothed woman, accompanied by a colorful procession, was brought from her father's house to the house of her groom, and the legal tie with him was consummated. So it sounds like
Well, in verse 19, it says he was furious about it and abandoned his wife and went back home to live with his father and mother.
this here says no consummation actually takes place. It is a matter of finalizing the marriage. I'm going to ask this different.
Well, we don't know how much time between when Samson abandoned her that she married the best man.
Well, and it does say in verse 20, so his wife was given in marriage to the man who had been Samson's best man at the wedding.
What a
But
friend.
remember how there were all those different rules on marriage, and
Yeah,
was that in Zechariah?
that probably would be Leviticus.
We didn't study
Oh, we didn't study
Leviticus though.
But I mean, the rules would probably be in Leviticus.
Well, yeah. because like if it was like if the husband left, but then if the husband came back, he could reclaim her.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Okay, keep going. I'll keep looking.
Okay, 14, 16 to 18. Samson's wife wept. She cheated and manipulated, working against Samson's expectations that the men must come up with the answer. The men also cheated and threatened, having murder in their hearts and putting pressure on the woman. 14:19, his anger. God blesses the one who had been wronged. Samson's anger may be legitimate, a righteous indignation against deceit. The battle with the men at Ashkelon, about 23 miles away, was a part of the war between Israel and Philistia. 14:20, Samson's wife was given. Another act of treachery was done. The Philistine father had no reason to assume that Samson would not be back, nor had Samson given word about not returning. The father, as a Philistine, did not want his daughter marrying the enemy.
Hmm.
That's it for John.
I don't have an answer to our question, but this is very interesting. It said it was custom for the bride to join the groom's father's household rather than the groom and the bride establishing their own household. So if the bride and groom were of marriageable age, the groom would return to his father's house after the betrothal to prepare a bridal chamber. This process traditionally took a year or more, the length of time dictated by the groom's father. When the place was complete, the groom would return and fetch his bride. The bride would not know the day or the hour of her husband to be's return, just like Jesus for us. So the groom's arrival was usually announced with a trumpet call and a shout, so the bride had some forewarning. The bride would, before the ceremony, she would take part in a ritual cleaning. And after the ceremony, the couple would attend a wedding feast.
So that answers at the feast, they were married. They had already been married.
I would think so, yeah.
Oh, here's I have a little footnote and a map in my Bible. It says Samson's ventures. Samson grew up in Zorah, wanted to marry a Philistine girl from Timnah. Tricked at his own wedding feast, he went to Ashkelon and killed some Philistine men and stole their coats to pay off a bet. Samson then let himself be captured and brought to Lehi, where he snapped his ropes and killed 1,000 people. Never mind, that's moving on into 15.
I would say the betrothal, though, they were considered married during the engagement period. So I would say she was considered his wife and he handed her off.
Well, in 20, it says, so his wife was married instead. His wife was married instead to the fellow who had been best man.
Mine says, and Samson's wife was given to his companion.
Well, and there had been a wedding. There was a wedding because it says the fellow who had been best man at Samson's wedding. So they had a wedding and she was his wife.
So where was the divorce?
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like he just handed her over. I can picture this. Like I'm ticked because this person that I trusted betrayed me, and like I'm really mad about that. And I'm just like, here, you can have her. Since you sided with them and you helped them, you go with them.
Is there a difference between having a wedding and then actually being married?
They are considered married during the engagement period. Joseph, remember, she became pregnant even though they hadn't consummated the marriage, and he was going to give her a certificate of divorce. They were only engaged.
If you look at verse 7 and 8, when Samson arrived in Timnah, he talked with the woman and was very pleased with her. And then 8, later, when he returned to Timnah for the wedding. So that is that year period?
Mm.
Did you say the engagement was a year, Chrissy?
It said yes, they would become betrothed, and then he would spend the next year putting together a bridal chamber.
But I think between verse 7 and 8, a year transpired, and that's when he found the honey.
Well, I'm sure Worsby will give us a lot of details. Were you done, Cindy?
Yeah, but what's the significance of the lion and the honey?
Right.
I don't know.
I agree. John the Baptist did that, and he was a Nazarite.
Well, we'll see if Worsby tells us. Here we go. According to Hebrews 11:32, Samson was a man of faith, but he certainly wasn't a man of faith, a faithful man. He wasn't faithful to his parents' teaching, his Nazarite vow, or the laws of the Lord. It didn't take long for Samson to lose almost everything the Lord had given him except his great strength, and he finally lost that as well. He lost respect for his parents, verses 1-4. The Lord had given Samson a godly heritage, and he had been raised to honor the Lord. But when Samson fell in love, he wouldn't listen to his parents when they warned him. Samson had wandered 4 miles into enemy territory where he was captivated by a Philistine woman and decided to marry her. This, of course, was contrary to God's law, and there are references to Exodus, Deuteronomy, and 2 Corinthians. Samson was living by sight and not by faith. He was controlled by the lust of his eyes rather than by the law of the Lord. The important thing to Samson was not pleasing the Lord or even pleasing his parents, but pleasing himself. When God isn't permitted to rule in our lives, he overrules and works out his will in spite of our decisions. Of course, we're the losers for rebelling against him, but God will accomplish his purposes either with us or in spite of us. And there's a reference to Esther. Samson should have been going to war instead of to a wedding, but God used this event to give Samson occasion to attack the enemy. Because of this event, Samson killed 30 men, burned up the enemy crops, slaughtered a great number of Philistines, and slew 1,000 men. Samson hadn't planned these things, but God worked them out just the same. He lost his Nazarite separation, verses 5-9. When Samson and his parents went down to Timnah to make arrangements for the marriage, it appears that Samson left the main road and his parents and went on a detour into the vineyards, and there a lion attacked him. A vineyard was a dangerous place for a man who was not supposed to have anything to do with grapes. Numbers 6, 1-4. Did God send the lion as a warning to Samson that he was walking on the wrong path? The Holy Spirit gave Samson power to defeat the enemy, but Samson persisted on his path of disobedience into enemy territory and an unlawful wedding. Some weeks later, when Samson returned to claim his bride, he once again turned aside into the vineyard, and this time to look at his trophy and perhaps gloat over his victory. His sin began with lust of the flesh and lust of the eyes, and now it included the pride of life. When Samson ate the honey from the lion's carcass, he was defiled by a dead body, and that part of his Nazarite dedication was destroyed. In fact, 2/3 of his vow was now gone, for he had defiled himself by going into the vineyard and by eating the food from the dead body. There's a footnote here. The week-long wedding feast certainly involved wine, and it's probable that Samson drank it. He was the bridegroom and was expected to encourage his guests to enjoy themselves. The word translated feast means a drinking party. He lost control of his tongue, verses 10 to 18. Since Samson hadn't brought any men with him to serve as friends of the bridegroom, the Philistines rounded up 30 men to do the job for him. These men may also have served as guards for the Philistines, for Samson's reputation has preceded him, and they were never sure what he would do next. Since the atmosphere must have been tense at the beginning of the feast, Samson sought to liven things up by posting a riddle. Sad to say, he constructed the riddle out of the experience of his sin. He didn't take seriously the fact that he had violated his Nazirite vows. It's bad enough to disobey God, but when you make a joke out of it, you've sunk into new depths of spiritual insensitivity. It would have been an expensive thing for the 30 guests to supply Samson with 60 garments. So they were desperate to learn the answer to the riddle. Their only recourse was to enlist the help of Samson's wife. Thus they threatened to kill her and burn down her father's house if she didn't supply the answer before the week was up. Samson resolutely refused to tell her, but on the 7th day he relented. Since the marriage was to be consummated on the 7th day, perhaps that had something to do with it. First, the Philistine woman enticed him. Then she controlled him. Then she betrayed him, which is the way the world always treats the compromising believer. Samson
Those 3 steps again. First she
enticed him in verse 1. Then she controlled him, verse 17, and betrayed him, verse 17.
Okay.
Samson could kill lions and break ropes, but he couldn't overcome the power of a woman's tears. We wonder how his wife felt being compared to a heifer. Sorry. The proverb simply means you couldn't have done what you did if you hadn't broken the rules, because heifers weren't used for plowing. Since the guests had played foul, technically Samson could have refused to pay the price, but he generously agreed to keep his promise. Perhaps he found out that his wife's life had been threatened and he didn't want to put her and her family into jeopardy again. Those who can't control their tongue can't control their bodies. And in Samson's case, the consequences of his lack of discipline were disastrous. Samson lost his temper, verses 19 to 20. And he went 20 miles away to Ashkelon to the news of the slaughter, so the news of the slaughter wouldn't get back to Timnah too soon. His joke about the lion and the honey ceased to be a joke, for it led to the death of 30 men whose garments Samson confiscated. Samson was so angry that he didn't even consummate the marriage, but went back to Zorah and stayed with his parents.
I kind of feel like he might have been saying, oh, you want the 30 garments since you cheated and lied? I'm just going to go kill your people to get that for you.
That's what I thought. That's where he got him. He killed their people.
Mm-hmm. You want to play fair? I'll play fair, you know?
Where was he going to get them otherwise?
Well, he was wealthy. But I find it interesting that he didn't even have any friends to come to his wedding.
Yeah, he had to get from there.
Like,
Maybe they didn't want to go to Philistine wedding.
well, and we have to remember too that he ruled his 20 years while the Philistines were ruling the Israelites. So the Philistines were in control of the Israelites at this point. They ruled over.
His friends may have said, we're not going into a pack of Philistines and festival, drinking party.
Yeah,
with
really.
them. What could happen to us? I don't blame them for not wanting to go.
It's almost like Samson would have been the new kid at school that thought everybody was being his friends when they weren't.
Gullible.
There's a note here that kind of maybe explains a little bit about the marriage. There was a form of marriage in which the wife remained with her parents and the husband visited her from time to time. But even if that were the case, the wife would expect her husband to consummate the marriage before going away. Perhaps Samson hoped to do that when he visited her at the wheat harvest. And it has a reference for chapter 15, verse 1 to 3. But then he learned that she wasn't his wife.
What?
Just wait till we get to the first 3 chapters in 15. You'll get it, Cindy.
Yeah.
I just read
Wow.
ahead a little bit.
While he was away from Timnah, his wife was given to the best man. The Lord used this turn of events to motivate Samson to decide to fight the Philistines instead of entertaining them. If Samson had won his way and married a Philistine woman, that relationship would have crippled the work God had called him to do. Believers today who enter into unholy alliances are sinning and hindering the work of the Lord too. If Samson had sought God's leading, the Lord would have directed him. Instead, Samson went his own way, and the Lord had to overrule his selfish decisions. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will guide you with my eye. Do not be like the horse or like the mule, which have no understanding, which must be harnessed with bit and bridle, else they will not come near you. Psalm 32, 8, 9. If we're looking by faith into the face of the Lord, he can guide us with his eye, the way parents guide their children. But if we turn our backs on him, he has to treat us like animals and harness us. Samson was either impetuously rushing ahead like the horse or stubbornly holding back like the mule, and God had to deal with him.
All right, I'm going to get through 14 here. 14, 1 through 4. For a man set apart for God's service since birth, Samson made some questionable life decisions, ultimately proving that God can use a person in spite of himself. Samson went down to Timnah and saw a young Philistine woman there. He told his parents to arrange a marriage with her, and her parents, I'm surprised his parents didn't already have an arranged marriage because that would have been odd that they hadn't. His parents tried to speak wisdom into his life by telling him he should not marry someone who was not part of God's people, but they didn't know that his interest in this particular woman was from the Lord, who wanted the Philistines to provide an opportunity for confrontation. God threw a curveball. He used Samson's fascination with this woman to create an opportunity to deliver his people. God was providentially working uniquely in Samson's circumstances to accomplish his purpose. This also makes me think, I'm injecting something here, that, as long as we're trying and we're trying to do what's pleasing to the Lord, God will take whatever that is, even if we screw up, and be able to use it in his plan. So I would think that at least trying is better than not trying. Even, like how we question ourselves, like, should I, shouldn't I? Like, if you're trying to glorify the Lord in it, even if you're making a mistake, God can use it. Importantly,
Yeah,
though,
but I don't see, Samson's in the Hall of Fame for faith. Is it for being the most gullible and senseless? But yet God could work
impulsive,
through him?
impulsive.
Yeah, talk about impulsive.
Yeah, there he is. We'll find out, I guess. Importantly, though, a believer is not to use this passage to justify marrying an unbeliever. That's a good point. I don't think, though, he was trying to please the Lord when he went to marry her.
No.
That was probably a lust issue. Samson's parents were right. The Lord had warned his people not to intermarry with the surrounding nations because they didn't worship the one true God. See Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 3. And similarly, believers should not be partners with unbelievers. See 2 Corinthians 6:14. Christians should marry only Christians. A couple that is unequally yoked is likely to run into trouble. And may I insert there that just because they go to church doesn't mean they're a Christian. There's got to be behavior that shows they're a Christian. So you don't just marry someone like a lot of people do because they go to church and they say they're Christians. 5 through 9. On the way to Timnah, where his bride-to-be lived, Samson was attacked by a young lion, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on him, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands. This was a clear sign that indeed he had been elected and empowered by God for a supernatural purpose. But later, when he discovered that bees had made a hive in the carcass, Samson blatantly ignored the law of Moses regarding unclean food and took some of the honey. I feel like John MacArthur gave him a pass on this one,
He
saying that
sure did.
because it wasn't a dead person's body, it was just an animal. But I do think, although they did sacrifices,
I think it's two different things. That number one, he touched the body, a dead body, but number two, it was taking the food out of the unclean.
Mhm.
I think they're two separate. Was that because one was Moses' law, right? And the other was
Well, it would
because
have,
he was a
it would have
Nazarite.
been the law of Moses, like that, not to touch the dead body because he was a Nazarite.
Yeah.
10 through 14. At a feast, probably intended to serve as his engagement party, Samson decided to pose a riddle to the Philistines. Do you think he was like trying to show off a little bit? I felt like when we were reading that, he was like, okay, I'm smarter than you. Figure this out. The prize for answering the riddle within a week would be 30 changes of clothes. In biblical days, an additional set of clothing was a sign of honor and dignity. Samson, his recent kill and the accompanying honey on his mind, said, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. When the Philistines couldn't figure out the meaning, they became furious. So 15 through 20, the men threatened to kill Samson's bride, who, remember, was one of them. I feel for her. She was a woman, first of all, in a powerless society, and she's engaged to this outsider, and it's her own people who are mad and threatening to kill her and her family. I'm not sure that I wouldn't have done the same thing. And her family, unless she got Samson to tell her the answer and share it with them. Frightened, she wept in front of Samson for 7 days. But why didn't she just go to him and say, they're threatening to kill me? Like she could have, like, okay, my sympathy's gone, because she could have gone to him and said, they're threatening to kill me. And finally, he couldn't take it anymore because she had nagged him so much. So he told her the answer. Later, when the Philistine men parroted the answer, Samson knew how they had obtained it. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on him, and he killed 30 Philistine men in another town, giving their clothes to these men to keep the deal he had struck. After that, he returned home without his wife. The end.
Cindy, I got something here for you. Interestingly, the New Testament does not mention Samson's failures or his heroic feats of strength. In Hebrews, he is simply listed with others who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, and in other ways were given superhuman aid. In the end, Samson recognized his disobedience on God. When he died, God turned his failures and defeats into victory. Samson's story teaches us it's never too late to start over. However badly we may have failed in the past, today is not too late for us to put our complete trust in God. So when you were saying about why is he listed in Hebrews when he obviously was not faithful to God, and I was reading that, and I thought, well, it's basically that they turned his failures into the good. Is the what I take out of
That
that.
doesn't make sense, though.
No.
I guess he did something. He didn't just sit there and twiddle his thumbs. Maybe that's why.
Doesn't it in the end, though, he asks the Lord for his strength to come back, and that's when he kills
In the temple with the
pillars.
I guess we still have a couple chapters to go on this.
Yeah,
I
that's
know.
what I was going to say, girls. We have a couple
I
more
know,
chapters
I had
here.
to jump ahead.
All the good questions. Like, any other thoughts before we conclude for today?
Didn't this week fly by? Oh my.
Yeah, it did. Oh, it is Friday already.
Yeah.
Holy moly, how did that happen?
It is Saturday evening, Cindy.
Okay.
All right. Well, this will conclude the reading of God's word for today, and we'll pick back up on Monday with chapter 15, the rest of the story.
Everybody have a great weekend.